He thought he owned her. The penthouse, the prenup, the pregnancy, the perfect obedient wife who never raised her voice, never questioned his orders, never looked him in the eye when he lied. Damiano Moretti built an empire on fear and buried his secrets under layers of money, power, and carefully constructed silence. He believed he was untouchable. He believed she was trapped. He was wrong on both counts, because while he was in another woman's bed, his wife was already 3 moves ahead, and the documents she filed that cold Chicago morning were about to burn everything he built to the ground. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit like, and stay until the end. You won't see this ending coming. The envelope arrived at 10:03 in the morning. It came through the front entrance of the Moretti Syndicate's downtown headquarters, a glass and steel tower on West Wacker Drive that looked from the outside like any other corporate building in Chicago's financial district. There was no sign above the door that said anything about organized crime. There never was. The lobby had a reception desk staffed by a woman named Petra who answered phones in 3 languages and smiled at visitors the way a shark smiles at open water. The 11th floor housed the legitimate shell companies. The 15th housed the ones that weren't. The 23rd floor, the top, belonged entirely to Damiano Moretti, though he wasn't there that morning, and Petra already knew better than to say so out loud. The courier was a young man named Joel, 24, contract employee for a downtown legal firm, and he had no idea what he was walking into. He had a plain brown envelope sealed with red wax, not tape, wax, the kind nobody used anymore unless they were making a statement, and a delivery confirmation sheet that required a signature from someone authorized to receive correspondence on behalf of Damiano Moretti or the Moretti Group, LLC. Joel checked the address 3 times before he walked through the door. He had done enough legal courier runs to know that red wax meant a law firm was trying to be theatrical. He didn't know that theatrical, in this case, was entirely intentional. Petra smiled at him. He smiled back. He stated his business. She picked up the phone, spoke 2 sentences in a voice low enough that he couldn't hear, replaced the receiver, and told him someone would be down in a moment. The man who came down was not someone Joel would have picked out of a crowd as dangerous. He was 51, compact, with silver hair trimmed close, and the kind of face that looked like it had been making careful calculations since birth. His name was Enzo Cavallo, and his official title within the Moretti Group was Chief Operating Officer. His unofficial title was Consigliere, which was a word that meant, roughly, the man who knew where all the bodies were, sometimes literally. Enzo signed the delivery confirmation without reading it. He took the envelope. He thanked Joel in the measured way of a man who had learned long ago that gratitude and threat could sound identical if you calibrated your voice correctly. Joel left. The lobby doors closed behind him. Enzo stood in the center of the marble floor for a moment, looking at the envelope in his hand, reading the return address. The law offices of Thorne, Castellan, and Pierce, a name he recognized immediately and not in any way that brought him comfort. And then he walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 23rd floor. He opened it in the elevator. He read it standing up, one hand braced against the wall, because he had learned long ago never to let anything knock him off his feet if he could help it. He read it twice. By the time the elevator doors opened on 23, Enzo Cavallo had already begun the process of deciding how to tell Damiano Moretti that his wife had just declared war. Damiano was not at headquarters because Damiano had spent the previous night at the Meridian Tower Apartments on Michigan Avenue in a unit registered to a woman named Sophia Lane, 29 years old, former model, current recipient of a private monthly wire transfer that Damiano's accountants coded under Consulting Services, subcategory Entertainment. He had been sleeping with Sophia for 14 months. He had given her a car, a wardrobe, and the particular kind of attention he had stopped offering his wife sometime around year 3 of their marriage. He believed he was discreet. He was not discreet. He was simply powerful enough that most people chose not to notice. He woke that morning at 9, which was late for him, and lay for a moment in the kind of expensive silence that comes from triple-pane windows in a high-rise insulated against the city below. Sophia was still asleep beside him, or performing sleep, which she sometimes did when she sensed he wanted solitude. He stared at the ceiling and ran through his mental inventory the way he did every morning, The same private accounting that had kept him organized and dangerous for 20 years. Which deals were pending, which people needed to be reminded of their obligations, which loose ends required attention. He was, at his core, a man who believed that control was the only true currency, and he tended his control the way a gardener tends a wall, always looking for the place where something had started to push through. He had not thought about Celeste that morning. He rarely did anymore. He showered, dressed in the spare suit he kept in Sophia's closet, and was in the middle of his second cup of coffee when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Enzo. He answered. The silence on the other end lasted less than a second, but Damiano had known Enzo for 26 years, and a single second of Enzo's silence told him more than most men communicated in an hour. Talk, Damiano said. Enzo talked. Damiano set the coffee cup down on the counter with a precision that was almost gentle. He listened without interrupting, which was something he did only when the information was too significant to risk breaking with his own voice. He listened to the name of the law firm. He listened to the phrase divorce petition. He listened to the words fraud, offshore assets, prenuptial invalidation, and then he listened to the last part, the custody filing, the unborn child, sole custody, and his jaw tightened in a way that Sophia, watching him from the bedroom doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, recognized as something she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. She had seen his anger plenty of times. This was something else. This was the face of a man who had just discovered that someone had been inside his house, moving the furniture, and he hadn't noticed until the floor gave way beneath him. "Where is she?" Damiano asked. Enzo said he didn't know. Damiano hung up, picked his jacket off the back of the chair, and walked out of Sophia's apartment without saying goodbye. Celeste Moretti was sitting in a window booth at a cafe called Linden on North Clark Street, drinking a cortado that had gone mostly cold because she'd been too focused on the skyline to remember to drink it. She was 34 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. The weight of it carried forward in a way that had changed her posture and her relationship to her own body, though not in any way she resented. She wore a cream-colored coat that was too large for her, which she'd bought specifically because it made her feel anonymous, and her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of carelessness that was actually the result of effort. She looked, to anyone glancing at her from across the room, like a woman with nowhere in particular to be. She looked nothing like a woman who had just detonated an explosive device under the foundations of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Midwest. Her phone was on the table, face down. It had buzzed 4 times in the last 20 minutes. She knew who was calling without looking. She also knew she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because she had learned over 7 years of marriage to Damiano Moretti that the moment you picked up the phone was the moment you gave someone else the power to set the terms. She wasn't giving him that anymore. She thought about the first time she'd seen him. A gallery opening, 6 years before they married, back when she was still Celeste Aumont, assistant curator at the Brennan Gallery on Michigan Avenue, 23 years old and fierce, with the particular ambition of someone who has just figured out that the life they want is actually possible. She'd been explaining a piece, a Basquiat-adjacent work by a young artist from the South Side, raw and uncomfortable in all the right ways. And she'd turned around to find a man watching her with the focused attention of someone who was used to acquiring things he wanted. She'd thought at the time that his intensity was a form of respect. It took her years to understand it was a form of assessment. She picked up the cortado, finally, and took a cold sip and thought about Arya. That was the name she had chosen. Arya. She'd told no one, not even her attorney, Vivica Thorne, who was the only person in her life right now she trusted with anything that mattered. Arya was a name she had held privately for months, like a small flame cupped in her hands, and every time she thought it, she felt the particular courage that comes from having something to protect that belongs entirely to you. Her phone buzzed a 5th time. She turned it over. Unknown number. She let it ring. The offices of Thorne, Castellan, and Pierce occupied the 14th floor of a building on South Michigan Avenue, and Vivica Thorne's personal office had windows that faced the lake, which she said was intentional. She found it useful, she told clients, to be able to look at something vast and cold and indifferent while making decisions that would reshape the rest of someone's life. She was 47, black, with natural hair she wore in a close-cropped fade that somehow made her look both approachable and absolutely immovable. She had been practicing family law for 19 years. She had gone up against 3 organized crime families, 2 sitting politicians, and 1 Fortune 500 CEO whose legal team had outnumbered hers 6-1. She had never lost a case she believed in. She believed in this one with a ferocity that surprised even her. When Celeste Moretti had first walked into her office 11 months ago, not called, not emailed, walked in off the street with a portable hard drive in her coat pocket and the careful, controlled bearing of someone who had spent a long time learning to look like she felt nothing, Vivica had listened for an hour without taking notes. Notes came later. First you listened, and what she heard in that first hour was not the story of a wronged wife seeking a settlement. It was the story of a woman who had been doing forensic accounting in her spare time for the better part of a year, who had traced 3 shell companies back to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, who had photographed documents while her husband slept, who had built a case from the inside with the patience of someone who understood that the only way to dismantle a fortress was to learn its architecture first. Celeste hadn't cried in that first meeting. She hadn't performed victimhood or resentment or fear. She'd sat across from Vivica's desk with her hands folded in her lap and laid out the evidence in the calm, organized manner of a woman presenting a business proposal. And when she was finished, she'd said simply, "I want everything he hid from me before we married. I want my child protected, and I want to walk away in a way that he can never undo." Vivica had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Can you give me more time with the offshore documentation?" Celeste had said, "I already have an audit trail for the last 6 years. I just need you to tell me if it's enough." It was more than enough. It was, Vivica would later tell her junior associate, in the particular tones of someone who had seen everything, the most thorough financial evidence package she had encountered from a non-attorney civilian in 2 decades of practice. Now, 11 months later, the petition had been filed, the envelope had been delivered, and Vivica was at her desk with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, watching the lake. She was thinking about the next 72 hours, which were going to be the most critical. She expected Damiano Moretti's legal team to move fast. They were expensive, and they were aggressive, and they had experience with exactly this kind of financial entanglement. She expected intimidation tactics, maybe veiled, maybe not. She expected phone calls from people she didn't know, asking questions designed to make her nervous. She had been through all of it before. What she was less prepared for was the call that came at 11:17 that morning, not from Moretti's attorneys, but from Celeste herself, calling from a cafe on North Clark Street, voice steady as stone, saying simply, "It's done." Did they receive it? Vivica said yes. They received it. And Celeste said, "Good. Then tell me what comes next." What came next, on Damiano's end, was controlled chaos of the kind that reveals the true architecture of a man's character. He was back at headquarters by 10:45. He walked through the lobby without acknowledging Petra, rode the elevator to 23, and found Enzo already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with the divorce petition spread across the conference table like an autopsy. 2 of Damiano's regular attorneys, brothers named Hartwell, twin sons of a retired judge, men who had been managing his legal exposure for 12 years, were on a conference call that Enzo had already initiated. The speaker on the table crackled with voices doing what expensive lawyers do when they first encounter a genuine crisis. They talked fast and said very little of substance. Damiano dismissed them from the call. He stood over the petition and read it for himself. He was not a man who showed fear. He had built his entire identity around the carefully managed performance of imperviousness, and it had served him well across 2 decades of negotiations, threats, and situations that would have collapsed lesser men. But there was something happening in his chest as he read the words of Celeste's petition. Not fear exactly, but a sensation adjacent to it. Something he had not experienced since he was 19 years old, and his father had looked at him across a table and told him that the world would take everything from him if he let it. A sensation of the ground shifting in a way that his feet, no matter how firmly planted, could not compensate for. She claimed the prenuptial agreement was invalid on grounds of fraudulent concealment, the offshore accounts, the Cayman structures, $14.7 million that had been moved and restructured in the 2 years before their marriage, money that never appeared on any financial disclosure he'd provided to her or her previous attorney, a soft, near-retirement estate lawyer named Caldwell, who, Damiano now realized with a cold clarity, had been entirely outmatched from the beginning. She had documentation. The petition cited forensic audit findings. It cited account numbers. It cited transfer dates. She had been inside his finances. She had been inside places he had considered impenetrable. He put the document down on the table and looked at Enzo. Enzo looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has bad news he hasn't yet delivered. "There's more," Enzo said. Of course there was more. The custody filing. Enzo walked him through it. Sole custody of the unborn child. The petition cited the nature of Damiano's business interests and their associated criminal risk as grounds for limiting his parental access. It cited his pattern of travel. It cited, and this was the part where Enzo's voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the way it did when he was delivering something he personally found impressive despite himself, a documented timeline of the affair with Sophia Lane, complete with hotel records, wire transfer records, and 3 photographs taken by a private investigator that Celeste had apparently hired 9 months ago. 9 months. Before she'd even come to them with any indication that the marriage was in trouble. Before the detached silences. Before the formal dinners where they sat at opposite ends of a table and performed normalcy for guests. She had been building the case 9 months before she gave him any reason to suspect her. "She played you," Enzo said, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing anyone had ever said to Damiano Moretti in this office. And the fact that Enzo said it not with satisfaction but with the flat respect of a man acknowledging a superior tactical move made it somehow worse. Damiano said nothing. He walked to the window. He looked out over the city, his city, the one he had spent 20 years learning to control in every way that mattered. And he thought about Celeste sitting somewhere in it right now, and he felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. He felt outmaneuvered. The marriage had not always been what it became. He told himself this sometimes, in the private hours, though he told it to himself the way a man tells himself a story that is true but no longer useful. He had been drawn to her intelligence first, which was something he didn't often admit. He surrounded himself with people who were competent at their functions. Enzo's strategic mind, his lawyer's technical expertise, his enforcer's particular skill sets, but intelligence that came packaged in someone who wasn't playing a role in his operation was rarer, and it had caught him off guard. She could speak about art with the same precision he used to speak about acquisitions. She understood negotiation, not in the explicit way, but intuitively, in the way she moved through a room, the way she measured people before she engaged them. He had recognized something in her that he recognized in himself, which should have made him more careful and instead made him want to own it. That was his first mistake with Celeste, thinking that what he recognized in her was something he could possess. They were married at a venue on the North Shore on a gray October day. 300 guests. The kind of ceremony that was as much a business event as it was a personal one. She wore a dress that cost more than most people made in a year, and she looked extraordinary in it, and she stood beside him at the altar and said the words and smiled the smile that she had already learned by then to deploy on command. Her family, her mother, her 2 younger brothers, a scattered collection of cousins from her father's side, sat in the front rows looking genuinely happy because they didn't know what they were celebrating. Celeste knew. She was beginning to know. But she was 27, and she was in love with a version of him that she would spend the next 2 years slowly understanding had never actually existed. And by the time the understanding was complete, the architecture of her life had been rebuilt around him in ways she could not simply walk out of. He moved her into the Moretti estate in Lincoln Park. He wrapped her in expense and comfort and the specific kind of isolation that doesn't announce itself. Her career at the Brennan Gallery became untenable, not because he told her to leave, but because his world gradually made her work impossible, the late nights unavailable, the professional relationships complicated by who she was now and who he was. She left the gallery 18 months after the wedding and told herself it was temporary. It was not temporary. The pregnancy happened in year 4, after 2 miscarriages that she navigated largely alone. And when the 3rd pregnancy held, when the ultrasound at 12 weeks showed a small, unmistakable heartbeat, she had felt something shift in her at a cellular level, a reorientation of every priority she had ever held. This was not going to be her life. Whatever else happened, this child was not going to grow up inside the particular cage Damiano had built for her, breathing its air, learning its rules. That was when she started taking photographs. The flash drive had been an accident in the beginning. She had been cleaning out the study, one of the few rooms in the house that still felt like hers, where she kept boxes from her pre-marriage life, her gallery notes, catalogs, the accumulated paper of a professional life she'd been forced to mothball, and she had found it in the pocket of an old blazer. She didn't remember putting it there. She tried it in her laptop and found it corrupted, then spent 2 evenings in a borrowed software tool recovering the files on it, expecting old gallery records or personal photographs. What she found instead were financial documents she hadn't put there and didn't recognize, files that must have been transferred to the drive by mistake at some point before the marriage, possibly during the period when Damiano had used her laptop briefly after his had been sent for repair. The dates on the documents predated their wedding by 18 months. The account numbers meant nothing to her at first. She was a curator, not an accountant. But she was also someone who had grown up watching her mother run the family's small, importing business on a razor's edge of cash flow. And she understood financial documents well enough to recognize that what she was looking at was a structure designed to move money without leaving obvious tracks. She photographed every file on the drive. She put the drive back in the blazer pocket and the blazer back in the box and the box back on the shelf. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark beside a man who was already mentally elsewhere and thought about what she had found. She didn't hire a private investigator for another 3 months. She didn't find Vivica Thorne for another 4. But from the night she found that drive, something changed in the quality of her patience. It became purposeful. It became architecture. She stopped grieving the marriage. She started building the exit. The Hartwell brothers called back at noon. Damiano took the call in his private office with Enzo sitting in the corner, a habit they had established years ago. Enzo as witness, as memory, as the institutional ballast for conversations that Damiano might later want a second account of. The brothers laid out the situation in the way lawyers do when they're speaking to a client who is both the problem and the solution, carefully, with calibrated optimism that was mostly designed to keep the retainer in place. The offshore documentation was serious. The prenup challenge had genuine legal merit, particularly given the jurisdictional rules around fraudulent concealment that Illinois courts had been interpreting more broadly in recent years. The custody petition was aggressive, but not necessarily fatal to his parental position. It would depend, they said, on several factors, including the nature of his business interests as they could be established in court. Damiano heard the phrase "established in court" and felt something cold move through him. His business interests established in court would not merely cost him half his legitimate assets. They would open doors that he had spent 20 years keeping welded shut. "That can't happen," he said. The brothers said they understood. "I need to know what she has." Exactly what she has. The brothers said discovery would reveal that in due course. "I don't have due course. I need to know now." There was a pause. Then one of the brothers, Michael, the elder one by 9 minutes, said, "There's another option. We could approach her attorney directly, signal that you're open to a negotiated settlement, get a sense of their actual evidentiary position before this goes any further." Damiano looked at Enzo. Enzo said nothing. "Do it," Damiano said, "and do it without making it look like I'm scared." The brothers said they would be careful. After the call, Enzo said, "They're going to make it look like you're scared regardless, because you are." Damiano said, "Leave." Enzo left. He was the only person Damiano allowed to say things like that, and even for Enzo it was a narrow margin, and they both knew it. Vivica received the call from the Hartwell brothers at 2:15 in the afternoon. She listened to their careful, well-rehearsed pitch, the suggestion of a quiet pre-discovery negotiation, the implication that Mr. Moretti was open to a reasonable conversation, the careful non-mention of any of the specific claims in the petition, and she said pleasantly, "Thank you for reaching out. My client has authorized me to proceed through the courts on this matter. We look forward to the discovery process." She paused one beat, then added, "It should be very educational for everyone involved." She hung up and called Celeste. Celeste was still on North Clark Street, now at a different table, having moved to the back of the cafe sometime around noon when the lunch crowd thickened and she'd wanted less visibility. She answered on the first ring. "He blinked," Vivica said. A pause on Celeste's end, then, how fast? 4 hours and 12 minutes from delivery to settlement overture. Another pause. Celeste said, that's faster than we thought. It means the documentation landed the way we planned. He knows what we have. He's trying to find out how much before he commits to a strategy. What did you tell them? I told them we look forward to discovery. Celeste made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. The short, compressed breath of someone who has been holding tension for a very long time and has just been given permission to release a small amount of it. Good, she said. How are you? Vivica asked, because she made it a policy to ask her clients this, particularly in the first 24 hours. Celeste was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me again tomorrow. You should go home. Rest. The next few weeks are going to... I know what the next few weeks are going to be, Celeste said, not harshly, but with the firmness of someone who has thought very carefully about the terrain ahead. I've had 11 months to prepare for them. Vivica said, right, yes. She paused. For what it's worth, today was perfectly executed. After she hung up, Celeste sat for a long moment with her phone on the table and both hands resting on the curve of her belly, feeling Arya move. A slow, rolling shift. The sensation she had come to think of as the baby's way of reminding her that none of this was theoretical, none of this was abstract. All of it was being done for something real and alive and already present. She had not allowed herself to feel the enormity of the morning until this moment. She sat in it now, carefully. The way you sit in water you're not sure of the depth of. She was not happy exactly. She was not relieved. What she felt was harder to name than either of those things, a kind of internal settling, like the moment when a structure you've been building in the dark finally makes contact with the ground, and you know, for the first time, that it will hold its own weight. She left money on the table, pulled on her coat, and walked out into the Chicago afternoon. But the first sign that things were moving faster than anticipated came that evening, and it came not through any legal channel but through a woman named Renata, who had been Celeste's closest friend since college, and who called at 7:30 with a voice pitched at the specific frequency of barely managed alarm. Cel, someone came to my building today asking about you. Celeste stopped walking. She was in the kitchen, in the brownstone she had rented under a name associated with a personal LLC that Vivica had established 6 months ago, and she had been making dinner with the focused attention she gave to ordinary tasks these days, because ordinary tasks were the only thing that kept the fear from becoming noise. She set down the knife she was holding. What kind of someone? He said he was a process server, but he didn't have any papers, and he asked what time you usually visited and whether I knew where you were staying. A breath. Cel, I didn't tell him anything, but I thought you should... You did right. Don't answer any more questions. If anyone comes to your door again, call me immediately and don't speak to them. Cel, what's happening? I saw something online. Someone posted about a Moretti divorce filing, and I didn't know if... Don't read anything online about this, and don't talk to anyone about it. I know that's hard. I know you have questions. I'll explain everything when I can. She paused. Are you okay? Renata was quiet for a second. Are you? I'm trying to be. She hung up and called Vivica's emergency line. Vivica answered in 2 rings. He's having my social circles surveilled, Celeste said. Someone approached my friend Renata today asking about my location. Vivica said, we expected this. I know we expected it. I'm telling you it started. A beat. Then Vivica said, your current address is clean. He can't trace it through any record tied to your name or the Moretti estate, but you need to be careful about your movement patterns. Don't go to the same place twice in the same week. Don't use your personal phone for anything sensitive. I know all of this. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. After the call, Celeste stood in her kitchen in the brownstone that wasn't in her name in the neighborhood she had chosen specifically because it had no connection to any place she'd been before, and she thought about the man she had married, and the machine he could set in motion, and the 7 years she had spent learning exactly how that machine operated. She had known this phase was coming. She had prepared for it. But knowing a thing and living inside it are different. And what she felt now, beneath the careful architecture of her plan, beneath the months of preparation and the evidence and the attorney and the strategic distance she had tried to put between herself and fear, was the small, cold animal recognition that she was not, after all, completely safe. That she had lit a fire, and it was burning the way she'd intended, but fire did not discriminate, and she was still within its radius. She finished making dinner. She ate alone at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the alley behind the building, at the ordinary Chicago night, at the specific texture of darkness that settles over a city when it's too cold for people to linger outside. Arya moved again. That slow, rolling shift. She put her hand on her belly and said, to the empty kitchen, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I've got you. Whatever happens next, I've got you." What happened next, at 11:47 that night, was a knock at her door. Not the buzzer. The door. The door of an apartment rented under a name that Damiano Moretti was not supposed to have any way of connecting to her. She stood in the hallway and looked at the door and felt her heartbeat change in a way that she recognized from the worst years of the marriage. Not fear of physical harm, because Damiano had never been that kind of threat directly, but fear of the specific violation of a boundary she had constructed with enormous care, the discovery that her careful architecture had a crack she hadn't found. She did not open the door. She stood very still and put her hand flat against the wall and listened. The knock came again, 3 times, even, unhurried, and then a voice, not Damiano's, but a voice she recognized nonetheless, a voice from a past she had not spoken to in 3 years, a voice that should have had no way of knowing where she was. Her younger brother, Marcus. She opened the door. Marcus Aumont was 31 and looked exhausted in the way of someone who had driven a long way without sleeping. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, and he had a bruise she definitely did recognize under his left eye. Fresh, maybe 8 hours old, the kind of impact bruising that comes from a single direct hit rather than anything sustained. He looked at her for a second, then he looked at her stomach. He said, "He found me first." And Celeste felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that all of her preparation had not quite accounted for. Because she had built the exit for herself, and she had built it for Arya, but she had not fully calculated what Damiano Moretti would do when he realized he couldn't reach her directly. He would go through the people she loved. He had already started. Marcus didn't wait to be invited in. He moved past her into the narrow hallway of the brownstone the way people move when they're trying to put a door between themselves and whatever is outside, and Celeste let him because there was nothing else to do, and because the bruise under his eye was telling her things she needed to hear before she could think clearly about anything. She closed the door. She threw the deadbolt. She stood with her back against it for a moment and looked at her brother, this man she had not spoken to properly in 3 years, not since a phone call that had ended badly over something she could no longer remember clearly. Some argument that had felt enormous at the time and now seemed like a footnote to a life she had been trying to escape. And she took in the bruise, the coat, the specific quality of his exhaustion, which was not the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept, but the exhaustion of someone who had been frightened for an extended period of time and had finally run out of the energy required to keep the fright contained. "Sit down," she said. Sit down first, then talk." He sat at her kitchen table, the same table she had eaten dinner at an hour ago, and she put water on because it was the only thing she could think to do with her hands. She stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment, listening to the sounds of the building, the pipes, the distant television from the unit above, the wind off the lake working at the window frames, and she ran through the implications of the fact that he was here, the fact that he'd found her here, the fact that his eye was bruised and he'd said, "He found me first." She turned around. "Tell me exactly what happened." In order. Marcus put his elbows on the table. He was a tall man, like their father, and he had their father's habit of making himself smaller when he was ashamed of something, drawing inward, collapsing the wingspan. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. "2 men came to my apartment this morning, around 8. I was getting ready for work." He stopped, started again. "They didn't say they were from Damiano. They said they were private investigators working a legal matter. They had a card. It looked real." "What did they want?" "They said they needed to reach you urgently, family matter. They said you'd been trying to contact me and couldn't get through." He looked up at her. "I knew that was wrong. You haven't called me in months, so I told them I didn't know where you were." "And?" His jaw moved. "The bigger one said something like," he said, "Mr. Moretti thought you might say that." And then the other one hit me. Once. Like a demonstration, like they were showing me what the alternative looked like. The water on the stove began to move. Celeste didn't touch it. They didn't ask you anything else? They gave me a phone number. Said to tell you to call it. Said to tell you that it would be better for everyone if you handled this privately. He reached into his coat pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. They left after that. Celeste looked at the paper. She did not touch it. How did you find me? Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mom. She still has the emergency contact you gave her. The number for the LLC. The office number. I called it and said it was a family emergency, and whoever answered gave me this address. Celeste closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. I need to make a call, she said. Don't go anywhere. Bug. Vivica answered on the third ring this time, which meant she'd been asleep, and Celeste felt a brief, involuntary guilt about that before she pushed it aside. He sent people to my brother. Physical intimidation. Single strike to the face, followed by a message. She kept her voice flat. She was good at that. They got this address through my mother's emergency contact at the LLC office. Whoever answered that line tonight gave it out. A pause on Vivica's end that contained, Celeste could tell, a rapid sequence of recalculations. The office line is staffed by an answering service after 6, Vivica said. They're not supposed to give out client addresses under any circumstances. Someone gave it out. I understand. Another pause. Are you physically safe right now? My brother is here. The door is locked. Okay, don't call the police tonight. I know that's counterintuitive, but if we bring law enforcement in now before our discovery position is established, it gives his attorneys a narrative to work with. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I'm filing for an emergency protective order, and I'm going to find out who compromised that answering service line. He's moving faster than we modeled, Celeste said. Yes. Which means the documentation scared him more than we thought. Or, Vivica said carefully, it means he's someone who responds to being scared with escalation rather than calculation, which is useful information, but it also makes him less predictable. Celeste looked across the kitchen at Marcus, who was sitting with his hands flat on the table, staring at the piece of paper with Damiano's phone number on it, like it was something that might move. I'll call you at 7, Celeste said. She hung up. She poured the water into 2 cups and put a tea bag in each one and set one in front of Marcus and held the other one in both hands, because her hands were cold in the way they got when the adrenaline was wearing down and her body was beginning its private accounting of the night's damage. She sat across from him. You should have called me, she said, before you drove here. You haven't answered my calls in 8 months, Cell. The sentence landed the way true things land. Not hard exactly, but with weight. She looked at her tea. I know, she said. I didn't even know you were pregnant. His voice had something in it now that was not accusation, but was close to it. The particular hurt of someone who has been excluded from something they felt entitled to be included in, and is trying to decide whether they have the right to say so. Mom knew. She called me 2 months ago. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to... Marcus, how to reach you without making it worse. And I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd have told me yourself. And then this morning those men showed up and I thought... He stopped. His hands pressed flat against the table. I thought something had happened to you. The sentence came out rougher than the others, with a crack in it that he didn't bother trying to hide. And Celeste felt something move in her chest, the specific tenderness that lives alongside estrangement, the love that doesn't stop operating even when the relationship around it has broken down. Nothing happened to me, she said. I'm fine. I'm more than fine. She paused. I filed for divorce today. He looked at her. And I'm suing him for fraudulent concealment of assets that should have been in our prenup. And I'm petitioning for sole custody. She watched his face move through a sequence of reactions. Shock, confusion, something approaching awe. And she continued. The men who came to your apartment this morning were sent because he's scared and he can't reach me directly. And you were the easiest pressure point he could identify quickly. Which means I underestimated how fast he'd move in the first 24 hours. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. How long have you been planning this? 11 months? By yourself? With my attorney. No one else. He was quiet. Then, Sel, he's... You know what he is. You know what he's capable of. Better than you do. Then how are you? He gestured at her, at the kitchen, at the visible calm she was projecting. How are you sitting there like that? She looked at him steadily. Because I planned for this. I planned for him moving fast. I planned for surveillance. I planned for pressure on the people around me. She paused. I didn't plan for the LLC office line being compromised. That was a gap. I'm closing it. Another pause. But I can't close the gap that is you if you don't let me. He frowned. What does that mean? It means I need to know that you're not going to do anything. Not going to call him. Not going to try to negotiate this yourself. Not going to decide that you can fix it by having a conversation with a man you have never once been in the same room with and who sent someone to hit you this morning as a greeting. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm serious, she said. If you try to engage him directly, you become a liability in my case. Not because I don't trust you, but because he will use you. He is very good at using people. I'm not going to call him. Say it like you mean it. I mean it. He met her eyes. I mean it, Sel. She held his gaze for a moment, making the calculation she had learned to make over years of watching Damiano assess people. The read of whether someone's word was their word or whether it was the word they currently believed but would revise under sufficient pressure. Marcus's eyes were tired and honest and bruised around the edges in more ways than one, and she decided, provisionally, to believe him. You can stay here tonight, she said. Tomorrow you go back to your apartment and you behave exactly as normal. Go to work. Don't vary your routine. If they approach you again, you say you haven't heard from me and you're not in contact with my legal representatives, which will be technically true. And if they hit me again, then you go to the police and you file a report and you call me immediately. He absorbed this. This is a lot, he said. I know. You've been carrying this alone for almost a year. Yes. He looked at her face, and at the visible weight of the pregnancy and at the brownstone kitchen with its careful anonymity, the rented furniture and the curtains drawn against the street, and she could see him trying to assemble a complete picture of the life she'd been living inside while he'd been estranged from her, and failing to quite get there, because the gap was too wide and the picture was too large. I'm sorry I wasn't, he started. Stop, she said, not unkindly. Not tonight. We'll do all of that later. He nodded. He drank his tea. Across the city, in a different kind of silence, Damiano Moretti was in his office on the 23rd floor, and he was alone, which was unusual. He had sent Enzo home at 9. He had sent the Hartwell brothers back to their offices. He had dismissed the two men he kept on permanent rotation in the outer office, the ones whose job description on paper was security and in practice was proximity. Bodies positioned to remind everyone who entered that Damiano Moretti did not meet with anyone without witnesses, and that witnesses had consequences. He was alone because there were things he needed to think through that he could not think through with anyone watching his face while he did it. He stood at the window. The city was dark below him in the specific way that Chicago goes dark in winter. Not fully, never fully. The grid of light stretching in every direction with the determined brightness of a place that has decided to resist the cold by flooding itself with illumination. He knew this city. He had mapped it in ways that no public record contained. He knew which aldermen owed him, and which feared him, and which had convinced themselves that the distinction between owing and fearing didn't matter. He knew which judges had been careful and which had been careless, and at what point in their careers the carelessness had made them available. He knew the city the way a man knows a body he has studied, not with affection, exactly, but with the particular intimacy of someone who has learned where the vulnerabilities live. He had not known where Celeste's vulnerabilities lived. That was the admission that kept returning to him as he stood at the window, and it was the one he found most difficult to sit with, because he was a man who believed, who had built his entire operational philosophy around the belief, that vulnerability was always knowable if you looked carefully enough. That every person had a structure, and every structure had a weak point, and a man who was patient and observant enough could always find it. He had been married to her for 7 years. He had watched her closely for most of that time, the way he watched everyone, with the slightly predatory attention of someone cataloging information. And he had missed this. He had missed the planning. He had missed the evidence gathering. He had missed 11 months of a woman living inside his house, inside his life, building the architecture of his dismantling. He turned away from the window and sat at his desk and opened the petition again. He had read it 3 times now. He understood it the way you understand a piece of strategy you have to respect, even as it is being deployed against you. She had found the offshore accounts, the Cayman structures, the layered LLCs, the transfers from the 2 years before their marriage. The money he had moved not out of malice toward her specifically, but out of the same reflex that governed everything he did, the reflex of putting things where they could not be taken. He had not thought of the prenup as a lie. He had thought of it as a boundary. The distinction had seemed obvious to him. He was beginning to understand that the law did not share his sense of obvious. He picked up his personal phone and called a number he had not called in 8 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, older, cautious, with the specific caution of someone who knows that a call at this hour from this number is not routine. Damiano. Salvatore. He kept his voice even. I need a referral, not the Hartwells. Someone who specializes in asset protection litigation. Someone who's been in rooms I haven't been in. A pause. It's midnight. I'm aware. Another pause. I heard something moved today. Yes. How serious? Damiano looked at the petition on his desk. Serious enough that I'm calling you at midnight. The man named Salvatore was quiet for a moment in the way of someone running through a list. Then he gave a name. Damiano wrote it down, thanked him with the economy of a man who does not waste words on sentiment, and ended the call. He sat at the desk for a long time after that. The name on the piece of paper was Gregor Vance, a family law and asset protection specialist who had handled 2 major criminal fortune cases in the past decade, both resulting in near total asset preservation for his clients. He was expensive, abrasive, and reportedly excellent. Damiano had one more call to make before he could sleep, and it was the call he had been avoiding since 10 that morning. He dialed Sophia. She answered immediately, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either, which meant she'd been tracking the situation through whatever channels were available to her. She was not unintelligent, Sophia, and she had been in his world long enough to understand that the silence following a rapid departure was its own form of information. I need you to understand something, he said, without preamble. A pause. Okay. The next several weeks are going to require complete discretion. Nothing goes to anyone, not your friends, not your family, not anyone you talk to. Whatever you've heard today, whatever you think you know about what's happening, you keep it in this phone and nowhere else. Her voice, when it came back, had a quality he had not heard in it before. Not anger, not hurt, but the flat, careful tone of a woman making a private calculation. Are you asking me to protect you? I'm asking you to be careful. Damiano. A breath. Did she know about me? Is that what this is? That's not something you need to. Did she know about me? He said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that it became its own answer, and Sophia said, I see, in a voice that had made its calculation and arrived somewhere cold and decided. You should know that 2 people came to my building this afternoon, not your people. A man and a woman with a camera. He sat up straighter. Why didn't you call me immediately? Because you left without saying goodbye this morning, and I didn't know if I was someone you wanted calls from today. She paused. Was I wrong? He said, call me every time. Everything. Understood? She said, understood. And then after a beat, Damiano, are you going to lose this? He did not answer that. He ended the call. He sat in the empty office for a long time, and for the first time in many years, he was unable to arrive at a version of the calculation that ended in his favor. The next morning came fast and gray over the lake, and Vivica Thorne was at her desk by 6:15 with 3 things open on her screen: the emergency protective order application she had drafted the night before, the employment records for the answering service that had given out Celeste's address, and the deposition schedule she was beginning to construct for the discovery phase. Her associate, a 28-year-old named Derek, who worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to prove something to himself, arrived at 6:30 with 2 coffees and the overnight news alerts that her system had flagged. One of them made her stop. She read it twice. Then she called Celeste. Celeste answered on the second ring. She'd been awake. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had not slept and was not pretending to have. "There's a story," Vivica said. "It went up on a legal industry news aggregator sometime overnight. Chicago divorce filing. Moretti. It's short, no details, but it names the case and your attorney of record." A pause. "It also mentions the offshore asset claim." Silence on Celeste's end. "Someone leaked it," Vivica continued, "not from our side. I need you to understand that the only people who received that petition before public filing were Moretti's office, and it came through official channels. The leak came from his side." "Why would he leak it?" Celeste said slowly. "That's the last thing." "He didn't. I don't think it was intentional. I think someone in his organization, someone who saw the petition yesterday, understood what it meant for their own position in the organization, decided that making the filing public was a way of accelerating the pressure on him, of forcing his hand before he could manage the situation internally." Another silence. Longer. "Someone inside his organization is trying to destabilize him," Celeste said. "That's my read, which means I'm not the only person who's been watching him and waiting. It means," Vivica said carefully, "that the walls of his empire have more cracks in them than either of us knew. And it means this case just became public, which changes the landscape in ways that are both better and worse for us." Celeste was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How much worse?" "He has nothing to lose by fighting this publicly now. The story is out. He can't contain it. And a man who has nothing to lose in terms of reputation management is a more dangerous opponent than one who's trying to keep this quiet. And better? A public case means everything he does to you. Surveillance, intimidation, the approach to your brother, goes on the record. His attorneys know that. It limits some of what he can do." A pause. "But only some." Celeste breathed out slowly. "He's going to come at me directly now." "Yes," Vivica said. "I think he is." "Then we need to move the—" Celeste stopped. A sound on her end. A sharp intake of breath, barely audible. "Celeste? Hold on." The sound of movement. Footsteps. Then Celeste's voice returned, lower, with a different quality in it. The quality of someone who has just seen something they were prepared for but were hoping not to see yet. "There's a car outside," she said. "Dark SUV. It's been parked across the street since I woke up, and it wasn't there when Marcus arrived last night." Vivica said, "Don't go outside. I'm filing the protective order the moment the courthouse opens at 8. Text me the plate if you can see it without—" "I can see it." She read out the plate number in a voice so steady it was almost frightening, and Vivica wrote it down and said, "I'm calling my contact at the investigator's office right now. Stay inside. Keep Marcus there until you hear from me." After she hung up, Celeste stood at the edge of the window, back flat against the wall, one eye on the street below, and looked at the dark SUV with its engine off and its windows opaque, and she felt the specific sensation of being watched that she had lived with, in subtler forms, for the entirety of her marriage. And she made herself breathe slowly and count the exhales the way she had taught herself to do in the years when Damiano's silences had been the most frightening thing in her world. This was not subtle. This was a declaration. He was telling her he knew where she was. He was telling her that the careful geography she had built, the LLC, the untraceable brownstone, the emergency contacts, and the clean phone lines, had been penetrated. He was telling her that the space between his reach and her body was smaller than she had calculated. He was wrong about one thing, though. He thought this would frighten her back. She picked up her phone and sent Vivica the plate number, and then she opened another contact. One she had programmed 11 months ago and had not yet needed to use, a contact listed in her phone simply as RF, and she looked at it for a long moment. RF was Richard Farlow. He was a former federal prosecutor, retired, who now worked as a consultant. He was someone Vivica had mentioned carefully in their second meeting as a person who might become relevant if the case developed in a particular direction. Specifically, if evidence emerged that Damiano Moretti's offshore assets had connections to activity that went beyond civil fraud. Celeste had not been ready to make that call in the beginning. She had not wanted to turn this into something larger than a divorce, something that could take on a life of its own beyond her control. Standing at the edge of her window with a dark SUV parked outside, and her brother asleep in the next room, and Arya pressing against her ribs with the insistence of someone who is almost ready to arrive in the world, she looked at RF's contact number and thought about the files she had found on the flash drive. Not just the offshore accounts, but the other documents, the ones she had photographed and given to Vivica, and which Vivica had looked at with a very careful expression and said, "Let's keep these in reserve for now." She thought about this car outside. She thought about the men who had hit Marcus. She thought about Damiano alone on the 23rd floor, running calculations, looking for the pressure point that would make her fold. He was expecting her to be the woman he had built her into, the woman who deferred, who absorbed, who chose survival over confrontation because the cost of confrontation had always been made deliberately too high. She scrolled to RF's number. She pressed call. It rang twice. Richard Farlow answered with the unhurried voice of a man who had been awake for hours and was not surprised to hear from her. "Ms. Moretti?" "Mr. Farlow." She kept her back flat against the wall, one eye still on the SUV below. "Vivica Thorne told me to call you if things developed in a particular direction." "And have they?" "There's a car outside my building. My brother was physically approached yesterday. The filing went public overnight through a leak that came from inside his organization." She paused. "And I have documents I haven't shown anyone yet." "Not fully. Not the second layer." A silence on his end that was the silence of a man shifting gears. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that go beyond civil fraud." She watched the SUV. It hadn't moved. "The flash drive I found, the offshore accounts were on it, yes, but there were other files underneath them. Transfer records that don't connect to any legitimate business structure I've been able to identify. Dates going back 11 years. Counterparties that don't have public-facing corporate identities." Farlow said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've held these back from your divorce filing." Vivica advised keeping them in reserve. I agreed at the time. She breathed out slowly. "I'm reconsidering. Because of the car outside. Because of all of it." She turned away from the window. "He's not going to negotiate. He's going to escalate until I either fold or make a mistake. And I'm 7 months pregnant, and my brother is asleep in my guest room with a bruise on his face, and I need this to be over in a way that I cannot achieve through family court alone." Farlow was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Not warmer, but more precise, the way a surgeon's voice changes when they have made a decision about how to proceed. "I need to see the documents," he said. "Everything. Not a summary. The files themselves." "When?" "Today." She said, "I'll call Vivica." Vivica did not take the news about the Farlow call the way Celeste expected her to. She took it worse. They were on the phone for 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, Vivica moved through a sequence of responses that Celeste had not seen from her before. Not panic, because Vivica Thorne did not panic, but something adjacent to it, a controlled urgency that made the air in the conversation feel pressurized. "You should have told me about the second layer of documents from the beginning," Vivica said. Her voice was precise and tight. "You told me to keep them in reserve." "I told you to keep them in reserve from the divorce filing. That's different from not telling me what they contained." "I'm telling you now." "Celeste." A pause. "If those documents contain what you're describing, if there are transfer records connecting Moretti's finances to activity that triggers federal jurisdiction, then this case stops being a divorce case the moment we hand them to Farlow. It becomes something else entirely, something I cannot control the trajectory of." "I know. Do you?" "Because once federal interest attaches to this, you are no longer just a woman divorcing a powerful man. You become a witness, potentially a material one. And witnesses in cases involving organized crime finances have a different set of risks than divorce petitioners." Celeste sat down at the kitchen table. The morning light was coming through the curtains in thin strips. She could hear Marcus moving in the next room. The creak of the guest bed, the sound of him waking up slowly. "He already has a car outside my building," she said. "He already sent men to my brother. The risk is not theoretical, Vivica. It's parked across the street." A long silence. "I need to see those documents too," Vivica said finally. "Before Farlow. I need to know what we're actually holding before we decide what to do with it. Come here, both of you, this morning." Another pause, then, all right, Anna. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Vivica first at 9:40, in a coat that suggested she had dressed fast and driven herself rather than waiting for a car service, which told Celeste something about the level of her attorney's alarm. Farlow 20 minutes later, a man in his early 60s with the compact, settled physicality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost more than money, carrying nothing but a phone and the particular stillness of someone who did not need props to project authority. Celeste made coffee. She set the files on the table. Not originals, copies. The originals were in a safety deposit box under her LLC name at a bank in Evanston. And she stood back while they read. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus had come out of the guest room, taken one look at the two people reading documents at his sister's kitchen table, and retreated to the doorway with a cup of coffee and the awareness to stay out of whatever this was. Vivica read fast, the way lawyers read, scanning, flagging, her expression giving nothing away to anyone who didn't know her. Farlow read slowly, going back, cross-referencing pages, his finger moving along lines of numbers with the attention of someone who knows exactly what he's looking at and is taking his time because the looking matters. After 22 minutes, Farlow looked up. He looked at Celeste, not at Vivica, at Celeste. "Where did you get these, Come?" he said. "Flash drive. Found it by accident in my husband's study. Files were on a partition I had to recover with software. And you've had these for how long?" 11 months. His expression didn't change. The counterparty names on pages 7 through 12, the LLCs incorporated in Delaware and Nevada with no public principals. Did you attempt to trace those? I got as far as registered agent names, dead ends. That's when I stopped, because I didn't know what I was looking at well enough to go further without making mistakes. Farlow nodded slowly. He looked at the pages again. "These aren't just offshore asset transfers," he said. "The pattern here, the timing, the counterparty structure, the layering, this is consistent with pass-through arrangements for funds that originated outside legitimate commerce." He paused. "I've seen structures like this in 2 federal investigations I worked in my last years at the U.S. Attorney's Office." Another pause. If what I'm reading is what I think I'm reading, Damiano Moretti hasn't just been hiding marital assets. He's been laundering money through those offshore structures for the better part of a decade. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivica said, "How confident are you in that read?" "Confident enough that if someone brought these files to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit today, there would be an investigation opened by end of week." He looked at Celeste. "Confident enough that your husband knows exactly what's on this drive and has known since the morning your petition landed on his desk. Not just that you found the hidden assets, but that you found everything." Celeste felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite the absence of it. A cold clarity, like the moment when the temperature drops enough that the air itself seems to sharpen. "That's why he moves so fast," she said. "Yes," Farlow said. "He's not trying to win the divorce case." She heard herself say it a half second before she fully understood it. "He's trying to get to those files before I decide what to do with them." Farlow said, "That would be my assessment." Vivica had both hands flat on the table and was looking at the documents with an expression Celeste had never seen on her face before. The expression of someone who has just discovered that the ground beneath a building she's been constructing has shifted in ways that require a completely different foundation. "Celeste," Vivica said carefully, "I need you to hear me. If we take these to Farlow's contacts, if federal interest attaches, there is a scenario in which Damiano's attorneys argue that you obtained these documents illegally, that the recovery of files from a corrupted drive on a device that may have been his constitutes unauthorized access. They will argue it. They will be loud about it. Will they succeed?" Vivica paused. "In criminal court, the standard is different from family court. I don't practice criminal law. What I know is that it becomes ammunition. It becomes a way to make you the story instead of him." "I understand that." "Do you understand that it could affect the custody petition? That if his attorneys successfully paint you as someone who deliberately gathered evidence through questionable means, a family court judge might—" "Vivica." Celeste said her name the way you say someone's name when you need them to stop and look at you. "I understand the risks. I have understood them for 11 months. She looked at Farlow. "What do you need from me?" "Oh, What Farlow needed took the better part of 2 hours to outline, and by the time he left the brownstone at noon, Celeste had signed 2 documents, committed to a meeting with a former colleague of Farlow's at the U.S. Attorney's Office 3 days hence, and given him encrypted copies of every file on the drive. Vivica stayed after he left. She sat at the table and looked at the place where the files had been and said nothing for a moment. Marcus had gone back to the guest room. The SUV outside had been replaced by a different car, same model, different plate, which told Celeste that Damiano's people were rotating surveillance, which meant it was organized, which meant Enzo was running it, which meant Damiano had committed resources rather than just sending a warning. "Say it," Celeste told Vivica. Vivica looked up. "I'm worried we've lost control of the case's shape. We never had full control of its shape. We had a strategy. The strategy assumed a divorce proceeding, a complicated, high-asset, contentious divorce proceeding, but a contained one. What we're now moving toward is something that has federal criminal dimensions, organized crime implications, and a man at the center of it who has every incentive to—" She stopped. "To what?" Celeste said. "To hurt me? To do whatever it takes to make those files disappear, including making the person who has them disappear from the proceedings." Vivica's voice was level, but her eyes were not entirely. "I want you somewhere safer than this. This address is supposed to be untraceable. And there's a car outside." Celeste said nothing. "I have a client's property. A friend's, actually, outside the city. Naperville. It's not connected to me professionally, and it's not connected to you at all. I'd like you to consider—" "If I run," Celeste said, "he wins the narrative. He gets to tell the story of a wife who abandoned the marital home and fled. That affects custody. You're not in the marital home, you're in a rented— It doesn't matter. The optics of a pregnant woman fleeing do not help me in family court." Vivica pressed her lips together. "Then we need something else. We need the protective order. Filed at 8 this morning. Judge Calloway's clerk confirmed receipt. We may have a hearing as early as tomorrow." Vivica paused. "But Celeste, a protective order is paper. It's legally meaningful paper. It is not a physical barrier." "I know what it is." Vivica looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has run out of arguments and has moved into a different territory. The territory of having done everything within her power and now simply being present with the person who has to live inside the risk. "All right," she said quietly. "What do you need from me today? Keep the custody petition moving. Don't let anything stall it. Whatever happens on the federal side. And I know that's going to take time. I know it could take months. The custody piece has to move at its own pace. Aria is due in 8 weeks. I need her legal protection established before she arrives." Vivica wrote something in her notebook. "Agreed. And find out who leaked the filing. I want to know who inside his organization put that story out." "I'm working on it." After Vivica left, Celeste sat alone in the kitchen for the first time all morning. Marcus was quiet in the next room. The car outside sat motionless in the gray afternoon light. She put both hands on her belly and sat in the particular stillness of a woman who has set something enormous in motion and can no longer stop it even if she wanted to, who has passed the event horizon of her own plan and is now inside its gravity. She did not regret calling Farlow. She did not regret any of it. But she was beginning to understand that the version of this she had planned for, clean, contained, a legal strike and a settlement and a door closing on the life she was leaving, was not the version she was now living in. She had found a thread and she had pulled it, and what it was attached to was larger and darker and more tangled than she had known when she started pulling, and there was no version of the next weeks in which she was entirely safe. She was thinking about this sitting at the kitchen table in the gray Chicago afternoon when her phone rang. Not her personal phone. The secondary phone. The clean one. The one whose number she had given to no one except Vivica and Richard Farlow, and the encrypted contact line she maintained for case-related communications. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She let it ring twice. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then a woman's voice. Not Sophia's voice. Not anyone she recognized. A voice that was controlled in the way of someone reading from a prepared script. They have memorized well enough that it almost sounds natural. "Miss Moretti, my name is not important. I work for Mr. Moretti in a capacity that gives me access to information you would want to have. I'm calling because I believe what he's planning to do in the next 48 hours constitutes a harm to you that goes beyond the legal proceedings. Celeste's hand tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? I work in the communications infrastructure of the Moretti Group. I have access to most numbers associated with parties and active legal matters involving Mr. Moretti. A pause. I don't have much time. Please listen. Celeste said nothing. She listened. Mr. Moretti retained a new attorney yesterday evening, Gregor Vance. You may not know that name. He does. What Vance specializes in is not merely asset protection. He also has a history of working with investigators whose methods are not always within legal boundaries. In 2 previous cases involving significant asset exposure, Vance's clients saw key evidentiary materials, documents, hard drives, forensic audit files, become unavailable before discovery. The cold moved through Celeste again, sharper this time. What you're telling me, she said carefully, is that he's going to try to steal the evidence. I'm telling you that Gregor Vance has a documented history of it, and that Mr. Moretti retained him 16 hours ago, and that there is a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning that includes 2 individuals who are not attorneys. A pause. There's something else, the woman said, something you don't know, about the flash drive. Celeste went very still. The files you recovered from it. You found the financial documents? Yes. The offshore structures. The transfer records. A breath on the line. What you didn't find, or what you may not have recognized if you did find it, is a secondary partition. It was encrypted with a different key. The financial documents were on the recoverable layer. The secondary partition contained something different. What does it contain? A silence. Then the woman said, Mr. Moretti has known about that drive for 8 months, not because you tipped him off, because there's someone in your circle who has been reporting to him. Celeste's whole body went quiet, in the way that the body goes quiet when the mind receives information it needs a full second to process. That's not possible, she said. But even as she said it, she heard the hollowness in it, the reflexive denial of something that, once spoken, had the terrible weight of something true. Vivica Thorne's office has an associate, the woman said. Young, male, been with the firm for 14 months. Derek. He has a relationship with someone in the Moretti Group's legal department. It predates his employment at Thorne's firm. Mr. Moretti has known the broad shape of your case since February. He has been managing his response to it since February. The fast movement after the filing, the surveillance, your brother, that was not improvisation. That was a prepared response to a timeline he already knew. The kitchen walls seemed to contract slightly around Celeste, the room becoming smaller in the way that spaces do when something fundamental about them has changed. He knew, she said. He knew enough. He didn't know about Farlow. He doesn't know you made that call this morning. That is genuinely new information for him. And when he finds out, and he will find out probably by tonight, the prepared response will no longer be sufficient, and he will move to something less controlled. Why are you telling me this? A pause. Longer than the others. Because I've worked for Damiano Moretti for 6 years, the woman said. And I have a daughter, and I have watched what this man does to women who try to leave situations he controls. Another pause. And because what's on that secondary partition, when it comes out, and it will come out now that Farlow is involved, it is going to end him. And I want to be on the right side of that before it does. What's on the partition? Celeste said again. The woman said, names, dates, locations, evidence of decisions he made 11 years ago that are not financial in nature. A breath. One of those decisions involved a woman named Elena Soto. You should ask Richard Farlow if he knows that name before your meeting on Thursday. The line went dead. Celeste sat with the phone in her hand and the dead line humming against her ear, and she thought about Derek, young, focused Derek, who had been present in Vivica's office for every significant meeting, who had taken notes with the attentiveness of someone building a record, who had been there in February when the case strategy was first fully outlined. And she felt the specific nausea of betrayal, which is different from other kinds of nausea because it has a name attached to it, a face, a specific history of trust that now has to be rewritten from the beginning. He had been feeding information to Damiano for months. Everything Damiano had done, the speed, the surveillance, the approach to Marcus, the rotation of the cars outside, It had not been the improvised escalation of a frightened man. It had been a managed response to a timeline he had been given in advance. He had known she was building a case. He had known the shape of it. He had been preparing his counter while she was preparing her strike. And she had been sitting in Vivica's office believing she was invisible, while someone in that same office was dismantling her invisibility piece by piece. She put the phone down on the table. She looked at the wall. She thought about 11 months of careful, meticulous work. The photographs taken while he slept, the forensic audit, the evidence package that Vivica had called the most thorough she had ever seen from a civilian. All of it built inside what she had believed was an airtight container. The container had a hole in it. It had always had a hole in it. And then the second thing landed, slower, the way the largest things always arrive last, when the mind has already been opened by the first impact and cannot close fast enough. He had known about the drive for 8 months. He had known she had the financial documents. He had been managing his exposure for 8 months, moving assets, restructuring, preparing legal defenses, which meant that the forensic audit, the evidence she had built the entire case around, was 8 months stale. He'd had 8 months to dismantle what she'd found. She picked up the phone again. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with the distant, observational part of her mind that always seemed to step slightly outside her body in moments of extreme stress, cataloging her own physical responses with the detachment of someone taking notes on a stranger. Her hands were not shaking. Her breathing was even. Her vision was clear. She called Vivica. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She stood up. She walked to the guest room door and knocked twice and opened it. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, with the alert posture of someone who had been listening through the wall and had heard enough to know that something had shifted. "I need you to do something for me," she said, "right now." He stood up without asking what. "I need you to go to Vivica Thorne's office in person, not call, in person. You ask for Vivica directly, and you tell her that Celeste says the office has been compromised and that she needs to call me from a line that Derek has never had access to." She held his eyes. "Do you understand?" "Yes. Go now. Don't take a cab from outside this building. Walk 2 blocks east first." He was already moving toward his coat. "Marcus." He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "Don't speak to anyone else in that office, only Vivica. If Vivica isn't there, you wait." He said, "I'll find her." After he left, she stood in the hallway of the brownstone and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its precision, that the case she had built, the architecture she had spent 11 months constructing with such care, had just collapsed in a way she could not repair from the inside. She needed to rebuild it, faster than he could move against it, with whatever remained that he didn't already know about. She walked back to the kitchen table. She sat down. She opened the encrypted notes app on her secondary phone and she began, with the methodical focus of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury she has never been able to afford, to make a list of everything she still had the woman's voice in her ear, that flat, careful voice reading off a deadline, when Vivica called back at 12:47 from a number Celeste didn't recognize. "New phone," Vivica said immediately. "Marcus found me in the parking garage. I'm outside the building. Talk." Celeste talked. She laid it out in the order it had happened, the way she always laid things out, chronological, specific, without editorializing. And she listened to Vivica's breathing change on the other end of the line as the information landed. Not panic. Vivica didn't panic. But the silences between Celeste's sentences got longer and more weighted as she continued. And by the time Celeste reached the part about Derek, Vivica's silence had taken on a texture that was almost physical. "Derek Saal," Vivica said finally. The name came out flat and precise, like a scalpel. "If the source is right." "She's right." A pause that cost Vivica something. "I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks how Moretti's attorneys seem to be ahead of our discovery timeline on the asset structuring. I thought it was a parallel investigation on their end. I didn't—" She stopped. "He's been with my firm for 14 months. I recruited him out of Northwestern. I wrote his recommendation letter for the bar." Vivica. I know, I'm—" A breath. "I'm past it. Tell me about Elena Soto." She said to ask Farlow. "I'm calling him the moment we hang up." A pause. "Where are you right now?" "Kitchen table." The SUV is still outside? Different car now. Black sedan, same position. Okay. Vivica's voice had reorganized itself into something operational, the emotion compressed into a smaller space and the strategy expanding to fill the rest. Here's what's happening in the next 2 hours. I'm going to call Farlow. I'm going to tell him about Soto and about Derek. Then I'm going to walk back into my office and I am going to behave completely normally because Derek cannot know that we know. Not yet. The moment he suspects, he alerts Moretti, and Moretti moves on whatever he's planning with Vance before we can respond. Minty, you're going to sit across from him and act. I've cross-examined people who killed their families and smiled while they did it, Vivica said. I can sit across from a 28-year-old associate for 2 hours. And then I'm going to need you to move. Tonight. Not Naperville. Somewhere I choose and that I tell no one about until the last possible moment. Not my office staff, not my paralegal, no one. A pause. I'm going to need to know that you and Aria are physically out of that building before Moretti's people decide that the cars aren't sufficient. Celeste looked at the window. The gray afternoon light, the black sedan sitting motionless below it. If I move tonight, he'll know I've been tipped off. He'll know something changed. He won't know what. It gives him information. Staying gives him access, Vivica said sharply. I need you to pick one. A beat. Where? Celeste said. Farlow called at 2:15. Celeste answered before the first ring finished. Elena Soto, he said, without greeting. His voice had changed from the careful, measured tone of the morning meeting. It was faster now, tighter. Where did you hear that name? The woman who called me on the clean line. She said the secondary partition on the drive contains evidence related to a decision Moretti made 11 years ago. She said it wasn't financial. She said to ask you if you knew the name. Silence. Long enough that Celeste counted it. 4 seconds, 5, 6. Elena Soto was a witness, Farlow said. 11 years ago, there was a federal investigation into money movement connected to a construction contract fraud scheme on the South Side. Elena Soto was a bookkeeper for one of the contractor shells. She was prepared to testify. 2 weeks before her deposition, she disappeared. He paused. The case collapsed without her testimony. The investigation was closed 18 months later for insufficient evidence. The kitchen was very quiet. Disappeared how? Celeste said. She was 31 years old, single mother. She took her daughter to school one morning and was never seen again. Another pause. The investigation into her disappearance went nowhere. The working theory, never substantiated, was that she had been persuaded to leave the country. That was the clean version. There was a less clean version. And Damiano's name was in that investigation. His name appeared in documents related to the shell contractor. It was never developed into a direct connection. The case closed before it got there. Farlow's voice was very even now, the evenness of someone who is controlling it deliberately. If the secondary partition on that drive contains what your source is implying it contains, evidence of what actually happened to Elena Soto, then we are not talking about financial fraud. We are talking about something that carries a very different set of consequences. Celeste put her free hand flat on the kitchen table. The wood was cool under her palm. She pressed down on it, feeling the solidity of it, the factness of it, while everything else in the conversation moved into territory she had not prepared for. He knows what's on that partition, she said. Yes. And he's known I had the drive for 8 months. Yes. Then the money, the offshore assets, the prenup fraud, the divorce filing. She heard herself arrive at it before she finished the sentence. He didn't move fast because of the divorce. He moved fast because he thinks I know about Soto. He thinks the filing was the opening move in something much larger. That would be my assessment, Farlow said, which means the cars outside your building, the approach to your brother, that is not a man protecting his fortune. That is a man protecting something that cannot be negotiated or settled or managed through attorneys. The sentence landed in the kitchen and stayed there. I need to see that secondary partition, Farlow said. Today. The copies you gave me this morning. Did they include it? I didn't know it existed this morning. Is the drive itself accessible? It's in a safety deposit box in Evanston. I need you to get it, not send someone. You. His voice was precise and unhurried. the way he spoke when he was being most serious. And I need you to understand what we are doing if we open that partition. We are not building a divorce case. We are building a federal case. And the moment that case exists, your protection looks very different, both better and significantly more complicated. I understand. Do you have somewhere safe to be tonight? Vivica is arranging it. Good. A pause. Miss Moretti, the woman who called you, do you believe she was telling the truth? Celeste thought about the voice on the phone, the controlled delivery, the specific detail, the name of a child, a daughter. Yes, she said. I think she was terrified and telling the truth. Then move quickly, Farlow said, because if she called you, there's a chance Moretti finds out she called you. And when that happens, the timeline compresses considerably. She was packed in 40 minutes. She had a bag already prepared, had it prepared for 6 weeks, in the back of the brownstones only closet, because she was a woman who had spent 11 months thinking about contingencies, and she added only what mattered: the secondary phone, the encrypted hard copies of the case files, a change of clothes for Marcus, who had returned from Vivica's office and was standing in the hallway watching her move through the apartment with the focused efficiency of someone who has stopped asking questions because the questions are clearly secondary to the pace of events. We're leaving, she said. I got that. The bag by the door is yours. There's a spare phone in the front pocket. It's clean, no history. Use it instead of yours. He picked up the bag. He did not argue. She looked at him for a moment, this bruised, exhausted, newly useful version of her brother, and felt something that was not exactly gratitude, but was in the same family as it. I'm sorry you're in this, she said. I was in it when they knocked on my door, he said. Let's go. They left through the back of the building, through the kitchen door that opened onto the alley, which she had confirmed connected to the adjacent block on the night she first rented the place. She had walked that alley 3 times in the past 6 months. She knew exactly where the cameras were and where they weren't. The black sedan didn't move. It was watching the front. Paques. The safety deposit box in Evanston was in a bank branch on a commercial street 2 blocks from the train station, and Celeste arrived there at 4:10 with Marcus beside her and her coat buttoned to the throat against the wind off the lake that came in cold and horizontal off the water this time of year. The teller recognized her. She'd been in 4 times in the past year and led her back without ceremony. The box contained this flash drive. It contained a sealed envelope with a handwritten note she'd prepared 6 months ago describing the drive's provenance and the circumstances of its discovery, signed and dated. It contained a USB backup of the forensic software she'd used to recover the files and the recovery log. She took all of it. She signed the access log. She walked out. Marcus was waiting by the door. Farlow's office? He said. Farlow's office, she said. They were on the sidewalk, moving toward the car Marcus had borrowed from a friend the previous night, a forgettable gray Honda that had no connection to either of them, when Celeste's personal phone rang. The personal one, the one she hadn't been using for sensitive communications. She looked at the screen. Damiano. She stopped walking. Marcus stopped beside her. She had not spoken to Damiano since before the filing. She had not expected to speak to him at all. That was the point of having attorneys, the point of the legal architecture, the buffer of professional intermediaries between her and the particular quality of his voice, which she had spent years learning to read and had spent the past 11 months trying to forget. She answered, Celeste. His voice was even, almost gentle, the particular gentleness she had learned over 7 years to trust least. Damiano. I think we need to talk. Without the attorneys. That's not something I'm willing to do. I know you talked to Farlow this morning. She kept her face neutral and her voice flat, conscious of Marcus watching her from 2 feet away, reading her expression. My communications are privileged. Celeste. A pause. I'm not calling to threaten you. I want you to hear that. I hear it. I'm calling because you found something on that drive that you don't fully understand. And before you do something with it that you can't undo, I think you owe it to yourself and to our child to hear me. I don't owe you anything. No. The admission came fast, unguarded, and it surprised her enough that she didn't interrupt the pause that followed it. No, you don't, but I'm asking anyway. Another pause. There are things on that drive A secondary layer you may not have accessed yet that involve people in situations that are more complicated than they appear. If you take those files to federal investigators without understanding what they actually show, the consequences will be Damiano. She said his name the way she had said Vivica's name that morning, the flat, stopping tone. I know about the secondary partition. I know about Elena Soto. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The gentleness was gone, not replaced by anger, by something colder and more honest than anger. The voice of a man who has just recalculated an entire position and is operating from the new numbers. Where are you, he said. Not somewhere you can reach me. Celeste. Something in his voice, a fracture, hairline thin, the kind you only hear when you've spent years listening to someone's voice the way she had listened to his. What you think is on that partition, whatever they told you. No one told me what's on it. I haven't opened it yet. A beat. Then don't, he said. Not yet. Give me 24 hours. Let me explain it to you myself before... No. Celeste. No. She said it once, clean, and ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk in the Evanston wind and she was shaking. Not her hands, not her voice, but somewhere interior, some deep structural trembling that she recognized as the accumulated weight of the day, finally making contact with her nervous system, bypassing the controlled exterior she had been maintaining for 11 hours and hitting the place underneath where she was just a person, tired and pregnant and alone in ways that no amount of preparation could entirely compensate for. Marcus put his hand on her arm. She let him. For exactly 4 seconds, she let him hold her arm on the sidewalk in the cold, and she breathed, and she felt Arya move, that rolling shift, insistent and alive. And then she straightened and said, "We're going to Farlow's office. Drive." Farlow's private office was not in the Loop. It was in a brownstone in Lincoln Square, different from hers, older, with bookshelves that covered every wall and a desk that looked like it had survived multiple decades of difficult decisions. He was there when they arrived, and he had company, a woman in her early 50s named Agent Sandra Chu, whom he introduced as a former colleague and current senior agent in the FBI's Chicago Field Office, Financial Crimes Division. Celeste looked at Farlow. "I called her after we spoke," he said. "Given the Soto dimension, I wanted someone here who could establish the appropriate legal framework for what we're doing tonight. If the secondary partition contains what we think it contains, the chain of custody matters. You should have told me you were doing that." "You're right. I should have." He said it plainly, without performance. "Are you okay with proceeding?" She looked at Agent Chu, who was watching her with the alert, neutral attention of someone who was very good at listening before speaking. "What happens to my divorce case if this becomes a federal matter?" Celeste said to Chu directly. "Family court proceedings aren't affected by a parallel federal investigation unless the court chooses to stay them pending criminal outcomes," Chu said, "which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. Your attorney would need to argue against any stay vigorously." A pause. "What does happen is that you and your child gain a different kind of protection. If Damiano Moretti becomes a federal target, his operational capacity is significantly constrained. And me, what am I? Right now, you're a citizen who came into possession of potential evidence and is doing the right thing with it." A measured pause. "That status is best maintained by complete transparency about how you found it and what you've done with it since, including this morning's meeting." Celeste looked at Farlow. He gave her the small, precise nod of someone confirming what she already knew. She put the flash drive on the desk. "Then let's open it," she said. Farlow connected the drive to an isolated laptop. He ran the same recovery software she had used 11 months ago, but faster, the practiced version. The primary partition opened immediately. The files she knew, the offshore accounts, the transfer records. Then he applied a secondary decryption protocol that Chu provided from a drive she carried in her jacket pocket, and for 30 seconds the screen showed nothing but a progress bar. Then the secondary partition opened. Farlow leaned forward. Chu leaned forward. Celeste stood behind them and looked at the screen over Farlow's shoulder, and what she saw was not at first what she had expected. She had expected financial records, more numbers, more transfer architecture. What she saw was correspondence. Dozens of emails spanning a period of 7 months between addresses she didn't recognize. She saw attached documents that appeared to be internal communications from the Southside Contractor Shell Company. She saw, on page 4 of one document, a name she recognized, an alderman who had been in office for 11 years and whose face appeared regularly in Chicago Tribune photographs at ribbon cuttings and charity events. And then Farlow scrolled further, and she saw a scanned document that was different from the others. Handwritten, one page, dated 11 years and 3 months ago. She couldn't read it from where she was standing. She moved closer. It was a note. 6 lines. The handwriting was Damiano's. She knew it with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent years reading grocery lists and appointment reminders in that particular forward-leaning script. She read the 6 lines. Her mouth went dry. "Farlow," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "I see it," he said. "What does that mean?" "Legally. What does that mean for him?" Farlow sat back in his chair. He looked at Agent Chu. Chu looked at the screen and then looked at Celeste with the expression of someone who is choosing their words with the care of a person walking across uncertain ice. "It means," Chu said, "that Damiano Moretti didn't facilitate Elena Soto's disappearance. He ordered it." The room held that sentence for a moment. "And it means," Chu continued, "that he has known this drive existed somewhere outside his control for 11 years, and that the 2 years before your marriage, the asset restructuring, the offshore movements, the prenuptial agreement, all of it was partly designed to put a legal and financial buffer between himself and anything that might surface." Celeste heard herself breathe. "Once, twice. He didn't marry me because he wanted me," she said, slowly. The understanding arriving like water rising, not a flood, but a steady, inexorable level. "He married me because I was a civilian, a normal person, a curator with no criminal connections and a visible, legitimate life." She looked at Farlow. "I was the clean layer." Farlow said nothing. He didn't have to. She had been part of the buffer. The respectable wife, the gallery credentials, the art world connections, the visible normalcy of a man who went home to a brownstone in Lincoln Park where his wife cooked dinner and attended charity events and gave the whole operation the human face of something that was not what it was. She had been used before the marriage began, before she'd walked into that gallery opening and turned around to find him watching her with his focused, acquisitive attention. She stood in Farlow's office in Lincoln Square with the flash drive's contents on the screen in front of her, an aria pressing against her ribs, and the accumulated weight of 11 months and 7 years, and one handwritten note that changed the shape of everything, and she felt the anger arrived at, not hot, not explosive, but cold, and absolute and structural, the kind of anger that does not dissipate because it has nowhere to go except forward. "I want to be in that courtroom," she said. Chu looked at her. "Miss Moretti, not as a witness, as the petitioner. I want the divorce case to move. I want custody established. I want every single legal proceeding that I filed to continue on its timeline, regardless of what you open on the federal side." She looked at Chu directly. "And I want my daughter born into a world where he cannot reach her. Can you give me that?" Chu held her gaze. "We can work toward it." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "We will do everything within our authority to ensure—" "Chu," Farlow said the name quietly. Chu stopped. He looked at Celeste. "Yes," he said. "We can give you that." Celeste nodded once. She picked up her secondary phone and called Vivica. It rang 3 times. 4. She was about to leave a voicemail when the line connected, not Vivica's voice, but a sound that took Celeste a fraction of a second to identify. The particular ambient sound of a hospital corridor, the intercom, the beep of monitoring equipment, and then Vivica's voice, compressed and tight in a way Celeste had never heard it. "Celeste, don't come to the office, don't come to me." A breath. "They went after Derek tonight when he left the building. They found out he'd been talking to us, to Moretti's people, I mean. They found out he'd been talking to both sides, and they—" A pause with something shaking in it. "He's alive. He's in surgery. But whoever Moretti sent tonight was not interested in demonstrating. They were interested in—" The word Vivica didn't finish was eliminating. Celeste understood this without needing to hear it. She stood in Farlow's office with the phone against her ear and the hospital sounds bleeding through the line, and she felt the last remaining structure of the world she had been operating inside shift beneath her feet in a way that was different from all the previous shifts, because this one had a body in it, a real body. A 28-year-old man in surgery who had been playing both sides of a war he was too young and too greedy to fully understand. And whatever Derek Saal had done to her case, whatever information he had fed to Moretti's people over 14 months, he had not deserved this. Nobody deserved this. "Vivica," she said, "are you safe?" "I'm at Northwestern Memorial. I came with him in the ambulance." A breath. "His wife called me. She didn't know who else." The sentence broke off. "I'm safe. There are 2 police officers here. I called them myself." "That's good. That's right." Celeste looked at Farlow, who was already on his own phone, and at Chu, who had moved to the window and was speaking in the low, rapid tone of someone activating something larger. "Vivica, listen to me. Stay at the hospital. Don't go back to the office tonight. Don't go home." "I know. When Derek comes out of surgery, if he can talk, I need to know everything he told them. Everything. Not for the divorce case, for Farlow, for Chu." A pause. "Chu is there?" "She's here. FBI Financial Crimes. She's seen the secondary partition." A silence on Vivica's end that contained, Celeste could tell, a rapid and painful reassessment of the entire evening. "How bad is it?" Vivica said. "What's on it?" "Elena Soto." 3 seconds. 4. "Okay," Vivica said, in the voice of someone who has absorbed something enormous and is choosing to process it later, because later is the only option available right now. "Okay, I'll call you when Derek is out." After she hung up, Chu turned from the window and said, "I need to make 2 more calls. When I'm done, I'm going to need you to stay here tonight, both of you." She looked at Marcus, who had been sitting in the corner of the office with his coat still on, a man who had driven from his apartment to his sister's rented brownstone the previous night with a bruise on his face, and had somehow ended up in an FBI-adjacent situation in Lincoln Square, absorbing information that kept expanding in ways he couldn't entirely track. "This building is secure. I can have 2 agents here within the hour." Marcus looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at Chu. "I want to be the one who tells you what to do with the Soto file," Celeste said. "Not Farlow. Not you. Me. It's my drive. I found it. I decide when it goes into official channels." Chu's expression was careful. "Within reason. Within the reason that I am 7 months pregnant and my attorney's associate is in surgery and I have been awake for 19 hours, and I still have enough to fight you on this if you try to take it from me." She held Chu's eyes steadily. "So within that reason." Chu said, "Fair enough. Tonight, nothing moves without your consent." Celeste sat down in the chair across from Farlow's desk and put both hands on her belly and felt Arya move and breathed, and for the first time since 10:47 that morning, she stopped. Damiano Moretti was arrested at 6:14 the following morning. Not at headquarters, not at his penthouse. He was at a private airfield in Wheeling, 40 minutes north of the city, where a Cessna citation registered to a shell company associated with a Nevada LLC had been fueled and filed a flight plan to Cancun at 5:30 a.m. He had 1 carry-on bag. He had Enzo with him, and a man Celeste had never met named Bertrand, who was apparently the 3rd point of a triangle that had been managing Moretti Group's most sensitive operations for the better part of a decade. He had been running. She learned this from Farlow at 7:03 in a call that lasted 4 minutes. Chu's contacts had moved fast overnight, faster than Celeste had expected, which told her that the Soto case had never been fully cold on the federal side, that there had been a file somewhere with Damiano's name in it, waiting for something that could reopen it, and the secondary partition had been exactly that thing. The flight plan had tipped a surveillance that was apparently already in place. The arrest was clean. No incident. She sat with the phone in her lap after Farlow hung up and looked at the ceiling of the small room in the back of his office building where she and Marcus had spent the night. And she thought about the airfield, the carry-on bag, the flight plan to Cancun. She thought about Damiano, who had spent 20 years building a citywide architecture of control and power and influence, standing on an airfield in the dark at 5:30 in the morning with a bag and a plane, trying to leave. She thought about this version of him she had fallen in love with, or the version she had believed existed, which was not the same thing, had never been the same thing. And the understanding of that distinction was something she had arrived at slowly and painfully over years, and was still, even now, arriving at in new ways. He had run. That was the final irrefutable truth of what he was. Underneath all the control and the power and the carefully managed imperviousness, a man who ran when the ground gave way. She had not run. She had sat at a kitchen table and made a list. Hot. Derek Saul came out of surgery at 9:17 that morning. The damage was extensive. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, significant soft tissue trauma. But he was alive and, by noon, conscious enough to speak. Vivica called at 12:44. "He wants to talk to you," she said. "Not the FBI. You." Celeste arrived at Northwestern Memorial at 2 in the afternoon. She wore the cream coat, still too large for her, and she walked through the hospital with the particular visibility of a very pregnant woman in a public place, which she had always found both useful and uncomfortable. People made space, held doors, directed soft, involuntary attention toward her, and she used the attention now as camouflage of a different kind. The normalcy of it, the way it made her look like someone with an appointment rather than someone at the center of a federal criminal investigation. Derek was in a private room. He looked very young in the hospital bed, younger than 28, the institutional pallor of the room and the monitoring equipment stripping away the professional confidence he wore in Vivica's office like a second suit. His wife was there, a small woman named Priya, who looked at Celeste when she entered with an expression that was equal parts fear and relief and something she couldn't categorize, and Celeste said, "Could you give us a few minutes?" And Priya looked at Derek, and he nodded, barely, and she left. Celeste sat in the chair beside the bed. She looked at him. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he had the look of someone who has been crying and has passed embarrassment about it. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. His voice was rough, compressed by the rib damage. "That's not an explanation," she said. "No." A breath that cost him visibly. "It isn't. Tell me what you told them, specifically." He told her. It took 20 minutes, interrupted by pauses where the breathing was too difficult, and Celeste sat through all of it without interrupting, without shifting her expression, listening the way Vivica had taught her to listen, for the structure of it, for the sequence, for the places where the information was complete and the places where it was still being managed even now, even here, even with a punctured lung. He had been recruited by a man in Moretti's legal department 18 months ago, before he joined Thorne's firm. The initial pitch had been framed as competitive intelligence, general information about Vivica Thorne's case strategies, nothing client-specific. He had told himself, he said, that it was a gray area. He had been in debt. He had a student loan balance that kept him awake, and a wife who was 3 months pregnant when the offer came, and he had told himself gray area until gray area became something else. And by the time he understood what something else meant, he was in far enough that the cost of stopping felt higher than the cost of continuing. He had reported the broad shape of Celeste's case in February. He had reported the discovery of the offshore accounts. He had reported the forensic audit timeline. He had not known about the secondary partition, had not known there was a secondary partition, and when Moretti's people realized the filing contained more than they'd anticipated, they had come back to Derek demanding the source of the additional information, and he had told them he didn't have it, and they had not believed him. Last night, leaving the office, 2 men had been waiting. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. The monitors beeped softly. Someone in the corridor outside laughed at something, a startling sound. "I'm sorry," he said. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she wanted to feel, and what she actually felt, and found that the gap between them was smaller than she expected. Because she had spent 7 years with a man who had made her into an instrument of his own protection, and she understood, at some cellular level, the way power differentials created the conditions for bad choices in people who were not equipped to resist them. Understanding it did not mean forgiving it. She was not there yet. She might not get there. "You're going to tell the FBI everything you just told me," she said. "You're going to be completely specific and completely honest, including about the timeline and including about the payments. And then you're going to talk to Vivica about whether there's a path forward for you professionally and legally, and that conversation is between you and her." He nodded. The nod hurt him. And Derek, she waited until his eyes came back to hers. The man who built that situation, who recruited you, who put you in it, he was arrested this morning. He is not going to be in a position to hurt you or your wife or your child. That part is done. His eyes filled. He looked away quickly, blinking, and she let him have the moment without commentary. She stood up. She picked up her coat. "One more thing," she said. He looked at her. "What you did damaged my case. It delayed things. It gave him time to restructure. But it didn't break it." She paused. "The case held. I want you to know that." She left him in the room with his monitors and his borrowed time and walked back out into the hospital corridor. God. The weeks that followed were not clean. She had wanted them to be clean, had imagined, in her more optimistic private moments during the planning phase, a kind of legal precision to the resolution, a series of decisions that would stack neatly into the outcome she had built toward. What she got instead was the actual texture of legal and federal proceedings, which were slow and loud and frequently disorganized, moving through the system with the grinding momentum of something very large that cannot be rushed, regardless of how urgently its participants feel the need. The federal case opened formally in the third week after the arrest. Elena Soto's case was reopened simultaneously, transferred from cold case to active investigation. The secondary partition's contents were entered into evidence through a chain of custody that Farlow and Chu had spent the night of the arrest establishing. Damiano's attorneys, not the Hartwells, who withdrew from his representation within 48 hours of the arrest, but a new team assembled rapidly from 3 different firms, immediately filed motions challenging the admissibility of the drive's contents. Those motions failed. Then they filed different motions. Those took longer. Enzo Cavallo, facing charges of his own related to the offshore structure, reached a cooperation agreement in the 5th week. His testimony, Farlow told Celeste in one of their regular calls, was comprehensive and damaging, and delivered with the precise, organized recollection of a man who had spent 26 years keeping meticulous records in his head against exactly this contingency. "He planned for this too," Celeste said. "He planned for everything," Farlow said. "He just planned for it to happen to someone else." The woman who had called her on the clean phone, the woman with the daughter, was identified in the 6th week as a communications administrator named Claire Ruiz, who had worked in Moretti Group's internal systems for 6 years. She had come forward voluntarily before the federal subpoenas reached her. Her cooperation was complete. She was placed in a witness assistance program. Celeste never spoke to her again, but she thought about her sometimes. The controlled voice reading off the deadline. The specific courage of a person who chose the right side, not because it was safe, but because they had a daughter and could not live with the alternative. Sophia Lane gave a deposition in the 8th week. She appeared in court documents as a fact witness rather than a target, which was, Celeste thought, probably the outcome Sophia had been calculating from the morning Damiano had walked out of her apartment without saying goodbye. She had been assessing her own position since that moment. Celeste understood that kind of assessment. She could not quite bring herself to resent it. The divorce proceedings moved on their own parallel track, which Vivica fought to keep separate from the federal timeline, with the focused tenacity of someone who understood that her client's life could not be held hostage to the pace of a criminal trial. Judge Calloway, who had granted the emergency protective order, and who seemed, from everything Celeste could observe, to be someone who took the fraudulent concealment claims seriously, moved the case forward with a decisiveness that felt, in the context of everything else, almost shocking in its clarity. The prenuptial agreement was voided in the 10th week. Fraudulent concealment, established by documentary evidence, corroborated by Enzo's cooperation testimony. The financial disclosure Damiano had provided before their marriage was found to have concealed assets of approximately $19 million when accounting for growth and restructuring in the intervening years. Celeste sat in Vivica's conference room when the ruling came through, a different conference room than the one where they'd been meeting because Vivica had moved her offices in the 4th week, relocated the entire practice 2 floors up in a different building, and had restructured her staffing with the thorough, controlled precision of someone who has learned an expensive lesson and intends to learn it only once. The new associate was a woman named Kayla, 41, second-career lawyer, former forensic accountant, who approached every document as though it might be lying to her. Celeste read the ruling, then she read it again. Vivica sat across from her and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Is it enough? Celeste said finally. The asset settlement is more than enough for you and Arya to live independently for the rest of your lives, Vivica said, without touching the federal forfeiture proceedings. Those are separate. That's not what I asked. Vivica looked at her. What did you ask? Celeste thought about it. I don't know, she said honestly. Arya was born on a Thursday in February, 6 weeks after the arrest, and 4 weeks before her due date, which was not the plan, but was Arya's opening statement about her relationship to other people's plans. She was 3 weeks early and entirely healthy, and she arrived at 11:52 in the morning with the particular urgency of someone who had decided that the outside world was immediately necessary and would not be waiting. Marcus was in the waiting room. He had driven from his apartment. He'd moved, a new place east of Wicker Park, and he was there before Celeste's own obstetrician, which was either a testament to his speed or to Chicago traffic. And when the nurse came out to tell him he could come in, he stood up and put his hand flat on the doorframe for a second before he walked through it, steadying himself. And Celeste, watching him from the bed, felt the particular complicated warmth of a relationship that has been broken and is being rebuilt slowly, with the careful attention that broken things require. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at Arya, small and red-faced and absolutely certain of her own existence in the way of all newborns, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. She looks like Mom, he said. I know, Celeste said. He sat in the chair beside the bed, the same way he had sat at her kitchen table in the brownstone that first night, exhausted and bruised and uncertain, but with the bruise healed now and the exhaustion of a different kind. The exhaustion of someone who has been present for something enormous and is still processing its size. They didn't talk about Damiano. They didn't talk about the case or the trial or the federal proceedings or any of the machinery that was still grinding forward in courtrooms and offices across the city. They sat in the room with Arya and the monitors and the February light coming through the hospital window, and they talked about their mother, who was flying in from Michigan the following morning, and about the apartment Celeste had found in a brownstone in Logan Square. Different neighborhood, different street, her own lease, her own name, and about what Marcus was cooking these days because he had, apparently, taken up cooking in the past few months as a way of managing stress, which was the most Marcus Almont thing she had ever heard. She fell asleep sometime in the early afternoon with Arya on her chest, and when she woke up, Marcus was still there, asleep in the chair with his coat bunched under his head, and the room was darker and quieter, and she lay still for a long time with Arya's weight against her and the sound of her daughter breathing. The brownstone in Logan Square was on a tree-lined block with a coffee shop on the corner and a small park a block east where, in spring, the trees came in fast and green and people brought dogs and sat on benches in the particular Chicago way of people who have survived another winter and intend to make the most of what came after it. Celeste moved in on a Saturday in early March. She had almost nothing, had chosen to take almost nothing from the Moretti estate when she left, because the things in that house felt like evidence of someone she no longer was, and she wanted to begin in rooms that had no prior meaning. She had her gallery materials, the boxes from her old professional life that she'd carried from place to place for years. She had Arya's things, which were extensive because newborns require an implausible amount of equipment. She had the books she'd bought since moving into the rented brownstone. She had a lamp she liked. She put Arya in the carrier and unpacked boxes, and by evening, the apartment looked like a beginning, which was what she wanted it to look like. Renata came over with food, too much food, an amount of food that communicated genuine concern for Celeste's nutritional intake since the birth. And they ate on the floor among the boxes because the table wouldn't arrive until Tuesday, and they talked until Arya woke up at 9 and required attention. And Renata held her with the practiced ease of a woman who had 2 children of her own, and looked at Celeste over Arya's head and said, "You look different. I feel different. Good different?" Celeste thought about it. "Lighter," she said, "but not in the way where something's missing, in the way where something was taken off." Renata looked at her for a moment. "That's a good way to put it." So, the trial began in April. Celeste was not required to attend every day. Her testimony had been given in deposition, and Farlow managed her involvement with the careful economy of someone who understood that she had a life to rebuild, and that the trial, important as it was not the center of that life. But she attended on the days that mattered, sitting in the gallery with Kayla beside her, watching the proceedings with the attention of someone who has earned the right to see the end of something she started. She saw Damiano 3 times in the courtroom. The first time, he looked past her. The second time, he looked at her, directly, for a long moment, and she held it, the way she had learned to hold things that were uncomfortable rather than looking away. And she felt what she felt, which was not triumph and was not grief exactly, but was something that lived in the space between them, the acknowledgement of 7 years and the ruin of them, and the particular sadness of understanding, finally and completely, that the person you had loved had never fully existed. The third time, when the jury returned after 4 days of deliberation, he did not look at her at all. The verdicts came on a Wednesday morning. Guilty on the money laundering charges, guilty on the conspiracy charges, guilty on obstruction. The Elena Soto case was a separate proceeding. It would take longer, the evidence more complex, the legal pathway more difficult. But the cooperation testimony and the contents of the secondary partition had reopened it in a way that Farlow described as unlikely to close again without resolution. Celeste sat in the gallery and heard the verdicts read and felt the room shift around her. The exhaled breath of people who had been holding it, the motion of attorneys gathering papers, the particular sound that a courtroom makes when something is over. And she was still, not performing stillness, actually still, in the deep way, the way she had not been still for 11 months and 7 years and possibly longer. She looked at the back of Damiano's head, the set of his shoulders, the specific posture of a man who has been found out, which is different from the posture of a man who has been defeated, because defeat implies a fair fight, and what this was, ultimately, was an exposure, the long grinding process of something hidden being brought into light. She thought about the flash drive in the pocket of an old blazer, the 2 evenings, and a borrowed software tool. The files she hadn't put there recovered from a corrupted partition, belonging to a past she had married into without understanding its shape. She thought about the morning in the cafe on North Clark Street, the cold cortado, the city skyline, the phone face down on the table and Aria moving for the first time that morning, the first time she had felt it so clearly, a distinct rolling shift that was unmistakably intentional, as if to say, I'm here, I'm present. Whatever you decide to do with this day, I'm already in it with you. She stood up when the session was adjourned. Kayla gathered her things beside her. They walked out of the courtroom and into the marble corridor, and Celeste blinked in the fluorescent light and breathed the recycled air of the building and thought about the apartment in Logan Square and the boxes and the lamp she liked, and Aria sleeping in the carrier that was sitting with Renata in the parking garage 2 blocks south, because Renata had driven her and had insisted on waiting. "You okay?" Kayla said. "Yes," Celeste said, and then, because it was Kayla and she had learned to be precise about these things. "Not entirely, but mostly." Kayla nodded. She was a woman who understood the difference. So, in Logan Square, spring arrived the way it always did in Chicago. Not gradually, but in a series of negotiations, cold days asserting themselves between warm ones, the trees uncertain until they weren't, the lake pulling the temperature down until one morning it simply stopped and the air was different. Celeste noticed it on a Tuesday, pushing Aria's stroller through the park a block east, and she stopped in the middle of the path because the light on the new leaves was a particular shade of green that she associated with the specific cross-circuitry of sense memory, with her first year at the Brennan Gallery, when she was 23 and the life in front of her had felt like a space she was building in real time. She stood there for a moment, Aria asleep in the stroller, the park making its ordinary sounds around her. She had called the Brennan Gallery in March, not to ask for her old position, which was filled, but to ask about a conversation. The conversation had happened over coffee with the gallery's current director, a woman she'd known peripherally before her marriage, who knew who she was and what she'd been through, and who looked at her across the coffee shop table with the careful directness of someone who is trying to assess whether a person is rebuilt or still rebuilding. Celeste had shown her a proposal, a curatorial concept, a 6-piece exhibition on the theme of concealment and exposure in contemporary visual art, featuring 4 artists she had been following since before her marriage, and 2 new voices from the South Side that she had discovered in the months since moving to Logan Square. The director had taken the proposal home. She had called 4 days later. The exhibition was scheduled for October. Standing in the park with the green light on the new leaves and Arya asleep in the stroller, Celeste thought about October and the gallery and the work she had spent the past months quietly preparing for it, returning to the language of her old life with the careful attention of someone relearning a skill they were afraid they'd lost, and discovering it was still there, changed but intact. The way things are changed and intact when they survive something that could have ended them. She thought about Damiano in a detention facility on the west side of the city, waiting for the Soto proceeding to begin. She thought about Enzo Cavallo, who had cooperated and would spend 3 years in a minimum security facility and had reportedly requested a transfer to a unit with a library. She thought about Claire Ruiz somewhere in a city she'd been relocated to, building a life with her daughter in rooms that had no prior meaning. She thought about Elena Soto, who was 31 years old on the morning she took her daughter to school and did not come home, who had deserved better than what she got. Who was the weight at the center of all of this? The thing that none of the financial victories and legal proceedings could address or repair. Only acknowledge, only name, only refuse to let be buried again. She had sent a letter to Elena's daughter, who was now 22, through the investigator working the reopened case. She had not known what to say exactly, and had written 4 drafts before she arrived at something honest, that she was sorry for what had been done, that it was not nothing that it was now being addressed, that she had a daughter too, and understood, incompletely but genuinely, the kind of loss that could not be recovered. She didn't know if the letter was the right thing to do. She had done it anyway because the alternative was silence, and she had learned everything she needed to know about the cost of silence. Arya stirred in the stroller. Not waking, shifting, the rolling movement that Celeste had first felt at 7 months and still found, each time, immediately centering. She looked down at her daughter's face, slack and pink, and entirely certain of her own safety, and she felt the particular weight of that certainty, the trust of a small person who does not yet know that trust is a choice, who simply sleeps in the confidence that the world will hold her, because the person pushing the stroller has decided, completely and without remainder, to make that true. She started walking again. The path curved east toward the street. The trees were very green. She did not look back.